It was probably 17, 18 years ago, when on a weekend I came home from college to the hometown where my parents lived to help a friend who was having a bridal shower that weekend. Her parents, or her mom and her mom's best friends had gotten together to host a bridal shower for her, and she hadn't chosen bridesmaids for her wedding. She kept her wedding very small, and so she had asked me if I would come and do one of the tasks that bridesmaids often do, which is to sit at the bridal shower and to write down everything that the couple gets and who it's from so that they can send out the thank you notes later. And as the party wound down and people sort of left, and we were sort of left with this pile of all the things that they had opened, and we're double checking our list to make sure we had everything accounted for. Her soon-to-be husband turned to me and he said, "You know what? Your dad had better not preach on the rich young man tomorrow." And we all got a good giggle, realizing that there are moments in our lives when this story is particularly difficult, when we have just received things that we're excited about, or when we take stock of what we have. I know that for me, one of those times that happens is when we're moving. Throughout our adult married life, Ross and I have moved homes every 2 to 3 years. And an astounding thing happens. And that is that every single time we move from house to house, we do this purging thing. You know, we go through and we look at stuff and we think, that has sat at the back of the cupboard and we haven't touched it for the entire 3 years we've lived here. Do we really need it? Or we open a box and find all the things that are still in the box that we moved it to that house in, and we try to decide whether to just close the box back up and move it to the next house to sit in storage there, or whether to sort through and try to see if those are things that we can do without. And what astounds me is that every couple of years, when we have moved, we've gone through and we've gotten rid of things, and we've made those decisions that we don't use that anymore, we don't need that anymore, those things can go. So how is it that we still have so much stuff? And there's nothing like having to put all of your stuff into boxes to move it from one house to the next to make you realize just how much stuff you actually have lurking in all of the corners and closets and shelves and drawers and cabinets of your home. And in fact, one of the years that I was doing this, it was a spring when I knew that we were going to be moving when the summer came, and so I was already starting the purging process, and I was doing it with some friends. We had sort of formed a group online, and we were encouraging each other by posting what we had gotten rid of that day. It was like somebody else's idea would spark you, oh, I could do that too. I don't need all of those old nail polishes I've had since I was 15. And so we were kind of encouraging each other, and a friend of mine who was one of my professors in college posted the George Carlin bit about stuff. And in this bit about stuff, he talks about how our whole lives revolve around our little piles of stuff. In fact, at the comedy club where he's at, he points out, and he's like, look, everybody on their tables has their little spots for their stuff. You know, this is my stuff, and that's their stuff, and when he gets here, that'll be where his stuff will go. And we have houses that become not much more than a place to put our stuff. And we make sure to lock up our stuff so nobody comes in and gets our stuff while we're gone. And then when we take off in an airplane, we look down and realize that it's just everybody's little piles of stuff. And how uncomfortable it is sometimes when we're staying in a hotel room or in somebody else's home, and there's not really room, especially in somebody else's guest room, and there's not room for your stuff. So you're trying to live out of the suitcase. And the way that we become slaves to our stuff. And I got a good giggle out of it, and it was good motivation to go through and reduce my pile of stuff that we were going to be moving from one place to another. But I remember when I read this text that even though I like to laugh about my little piles of stuff, there is an element to which Jesus calls attention to the ways in which the things we own might own us. There was a man named Francis, and we better know him as St. Francis of Assisi. We often think of him when we do a blessing of the animals, or when we pray the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, in which we ask to be made instruments of God's peace. But the story goes that early in his discipleship, when Francis was a young man who was helping his father run a clothing shop, there came a time when a family in need came to him asking for assistance. They were in desperate need of money, perhaps with which to buy coal for a fire, for heat, or perhaps simply for food. But it was basic necessities that they were without. And so he took some cloth from their shop and he sold it in order to have money to give to this family for them to be able to survive. And when his father learned what he had done, he was very angry because the cloth had not been Francis's to sell. Even though the shop, it was understood from the days that he was growing up, Francis knew that the shop would one day be his, that he was helping his father run it and that he would one day inherit it. Those things did not yet belong to him. And out of that experience, Francis had a different reaction than many of us might have had. Instead of arguing with his dad about the morality of what he had done and the importance of it and the fact that it would one day be his and it could sort of be taken out of his inheritance, Francis swore off possessions entirely. And when I say he swore off possessions entirely, I am talking this man took it to the extreme. The tale goes that he stripped down to his underwear and ran off into the woods to exist as one of the animals, trusting in God's creation to provide for him. Now, I'm not asking anybody to strip down to their underwear and go live in the woods, okay? So you can just take a little breath of relief. That's not what I'm asking for. But I do think that the extremity of his response invites us to think about the ways in which our possessions own us. The ways in which the tasks of guarding and keeping, of investing and growing, of dividing and dispersing, of deciding how to display or keep all of our stuff, holds us back. The rich young ruler comes to Jesus with an earnest question, an eager question. You can hear in his voice his readiness to follow and to do what is necessary to belong to the kingdom. But then what Jesus has to say to him is a hard invitation. You already know the rules. You already know all the things you've been taught in Hebrew school, and you're already doing them, but you lack one thing. I wonder how strange it must have been for someone who defined himself by his wealth to be told he was lacking something. That's not something that's very familiar territory for somebody who has all the resources that they need for themselves and perhaps to be able to provide for others, to be told that they are still lacking something. I wonder if the rich young man's impulse was to acquire. Tell me what it is so I can go and get it, Jesus. And then Jesus invites him to give up everything, to let it all go, to be freed of his possessions, to be unburdened by the things that threaten to own him, in order to be fully free to follow Jesus completely. I think about that. And I think about the popularity right now of programs like Financial Peace University, which have an element in which they can become about acquiring, about making sure that you protect your financial security. But they're also about debt reduction, about getting free from debt. And this is not about shaming debt. I'm going to be fully transparent with you all. I carry quite a bit of debt. Mine happens to be primarily student debt and medical debt, but we have debt that we owe. And so I know every month when money comes in, I'm not free to give all of it away, because some of it is already owed elsewhere. When I carry those debts, I'm not free to completely use my resources the way that I would choose to use them. And so I think there's an element of that that's part of why those programs are so popular, that we want to get free from the debt in order to be free to make our own choices with the resources that we have. But there's also an element that invites us into a new relationship with stuff, that invites us to remember not to let our stuff or our quest for stuff own us in ways that keep us from being free to live fully as disciples of Jesus. And this is where the stewardship part comes in. I remember that the gospel writer very intentionally doesn't tell us what the young man eventually does. We only know that he goes away grieving because he had many possessions. Every time I read this text, I wonder, does he go away grieving because what Jesus asks of him is simply too much and he knows he can never do it? Or does he go away grieving because it's going to hurt to let that stuff go, because it's going to require something hard of him? I always wish the gospel writer would tell us whether that grieving is on his way to sell his belongings and follow Jesus, or is his heartache that he can't bring himself to do what Jesus invites him to. But I think the gospel writer is wise not to give us the answer, so that we must wrestle within ourselves with whether we are able to answer that same invitation. Are we able to let go of letting what we own us? Are we able to take the energy we've been putting into our investments, been putting into the stewardship, been putting into the protection of our stuff, been putting into the dividing up and the deciding who gets what, and to put that energy fully into following Christ? I'm not asking anybody here to take a vow of poverty. I often breathe a sigh of relief that my own vocation as a pastor did not require me to take a vow of poverty. But I am asking, in this stewardship season, for you to take stock of what you own and what owns you, and to ask the question of yourself: what practice of giving will help me accept Christ's invitation into freedom? What level of giving will allow me to be freed of the burden of keeping and protecting and dividing and investing and dispersing stuff? What level of giving will free me to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? That answer is going to look different for different people sitting in different pews, the people in front of you, the people behind you, the people next to you. That answer is going to look different for each and every one of us. But I invite you into that kind of contemplation. Not to wonder, what do I have to give to keep the lights on at the church I like to go to? What do I have to give to pull my weight? But what can I give that will free me of the burden of stuff that owns me, that will allow me the experience of trusting in God's provision, that will give me the experience of remembering that all I have is really not mine in the first place, and to experience the joy that comes with being freed for joyful obedience. And for that opportunity, and for the ways in which I trust that God is already answering those prayers in your heart, I give God thanks. Amen.